Hey everyone, tonight we're embarking on a journey through 1,000 years of history, but not the history you learned in school. We're not talking about kings on thrones or knights in shining armor, no. Tonight we're going into the places where real history unfolded, where the unwashed masses gathered, where secrets were whispered over cups of ale and wine, where fortunes changed hands in the flicker of candlelight, and where violence could erupt at any moment. We're talking about taverns, inns, caravanserais, bozahouses, and pirate havens across a millennium of human civilization. From the shadowed inns where crusaders plotted their next raids, to the magnificent caravanserais of the Seljuk Empire that stretched along the Silk Road, from the plague-stricken alehouses of medieval Europe, to the fermented grain-drinking dens of Ottoman Istanbul, and finally to the lawless pirate harbours of the Caribbean, where buccaneers spent their blood-soaked fortunes. We're going to explore a world that existed in the margins, in the spaces between official history. These weren't just places to drink, they were nerve centers of crime, conspiracy, and forbidden commerce. They were where rebellions were planned, where spies gathered intelligence, where smugglers moved their contraband, where prostitutes plied their trade, where gamblers wagered everything on the turn of a card, and where a wrong word or a perceived slight could leave you bleeding out on a filthy floor before the night was through. So before we step through that creaking wooden door into this dangerous world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what aspect of tavern history intrigues you most. Now, let's begin our journey into the shadows. The Crusader-era, where holy warriors met unholy temptation. Picture yourself in the year 1199, standing on a muddy street in Nottingham, England. The air is thick with the smell of horse manure, wood smoke, and human waste. You're looking up at Nottingham Castle, and below it, carved into the rock itself, are structures that legend claims served a very specific purpose during the Crusades. One establishment that survives today, the Old Trip to Jerusalem, carries a date of 1189 painted on its exterior, and a story that has been told for centuries, though historians debate its accuracy. According to local law, this area served as a gathering point where King Richard the Lionheart's men stopped before embarking on the Third Crusade. Whether this specific building functioned as such a recruitment centre is impossible to verify, but what we do know is that taverns and inns throughout England during this era certainly played this role. Young men with more courage than sense were lured into such establishments with promises of glory, salvation, and plunder. Inside, veterans of previous campaigns would spin tales of riches beyond imagination waiting in the Holy Land, conveniently leaving out the parts about dysentery, dehydration, and death under the merciless Middle Eastern sun. The ale would flow freely, loosening tongues and clouding judgment, and by the time dawn broke, dozens of young men would have taken the cross, committing themselves to a journey from which many would never return. But this recruitment function, whether at this specific location or others like it, was just one small part of the story. The taverns and inns of the Crusader era were evolving into something unprecedented in European history. Before the 11th century, travelers had relied almost entirely on the hospitality of monasteries or private homes for food and lodging. It was a system based on Christian charity and feudal obligation, not commerce. But as the Crusades opened up new trade routes and the merchant class began to expand, this informal system became impractical. There were simply too many people on the move, too much money changing hands, too many opportunities for profit to leave hospitality in the realm of charity. The professional innkeeper emerged as a new figure in medieval society, one of the earliest examples of pure capitalism at work. These entrepreneurs recognized that travelers needed food, drink, and shelter, and they were willing to pay for it. What started as someone clearing out a room in their home and setting up a few benches quickly evolved into purpose-built establishments designed to accommodate the flood of pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, and adventurers crossing Europe. In the major cities of France and Italy, large inns and hostels began to appear, offering beds, chairs, mirrors, and even chamber pots for those who could afford them. But this wasn't an all-inclusive resort experience. Everything had a price, sometimes itemized to an absurd degree. Want a candle? That costs extra. Need your horse fed? That's another charge. Looking for a meal that won't poison you? Well, you'd better have deep pockets. The outlying areas were different. Here, taverns were more prevalent than inns, offering food and drink but rarely accommodation. If a room could be procured, you often had to share it with a member of the tavern keeper's family, a situation that gave rise to countless jokes and stories. including the now famous trope of the farmer's daughter and the traveling salesman. As these establishments proliferated, their keepers began to organize into guilds, recognizing that there was strength in numbers. These guilds worked to keep prices somewhat affordable, to maintain a steady flow of customers, but they also had connections with nobles and officials that gave them significant influence. When tournaments were held or particularly popular criminals were scheduled for execution, guild members would work to direct the influx of visitors to their respective establishments, creating an early form of destination marketing. But beneath this veneer of commercial hospitality lurked something far darker. The taverns and inns of the Crusader-era quickly became centers of intrigue, conspiracy, and crime. They were natural meeting places for people from all walks of life, which meant they were also natural gathering places for those with something to hide. Consider the situation from the perspective of a crusader returning from the Holy Land. You've survived battles, disease, and deprivation. You've seen your companions die in horrible ways. You've perhaps participated in atrocities that haunt your dreams, and you've looted what you could from the places you conquered. Now you're back in Europe with a purse full of Byzantine gold, Eastern silks, and precious spices. Where do you go? You can't exactly waltz into your village and explain where all this wealth came from without raising uncomfortable questions. So you find a tavern, preferably one far from your home, where nobody knows you. You drink to forget what you've done and what you've seen. You gamble, because after facing death so many times, risk holds no terror for you. You pay for the company of women, because you need to feel alive again. And perhaps, if you've acquired a taste for violence, you pick fights with strangers who look at you wrong. These establishments became repositories for the trauma and treasure of the Crusades. Tavern keepers learned not to ask too many questions about where their customers' wealth came from. They became experts at looking the other way when suspicious transactions occurred in their establishments. Some went further, actively facilitating criminal activity for a cut of the profits. The very architecture of these buildings lent itself to clandestine activities. Most inns and larger taverns had multiple floors, with private rooms on the upper levels. These rooms became spaces where deals could be made away from prying eyes. Smugglers could meet with merchants willing to buy goods without asking for customs documentation. Deserters from various armies could hide until the search for them died down. Political dissidents could plot against their rulers. The cellars were equally important for nefarious purposes. Originally intended for storing wine and ale, they often became hiding places for contraband. Some tavern keepers constructed false walls or hidden chambers where goods, people, or money could be concealed. In an era when royal authority was still tenuous in many places, and local officials were often corrupt or simply overwhelmed, these establishments operated with remarkable impunity. The religious tensions of the era added another layer of danger to tavern life. While Christianity was the dominant religion in Europe, the Crusades had brought Europeans into contact with Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians. Some of these individuals ended up in European cities, either as merchants, slaves, or refugees. Taverns, being spaces where social hierarchies were somewhat relaxed, sometimes became places where these different religious groups could interact, though not always peacefully. Before King Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church, many taverns and inns bore religious names that reflected their connection to the Crusades and Christian tradition. The Saracen's Head depicted the enemy that Crusaders had fought against. The lamb and flag showed the lamb representing Jesus and the flag representing the Crusaders themselves. The cross keys referred to Saint Peter, while the Christopher honored the patron saint of travelers. These names served as both advertisement and as a form of religious identity in a world where such things mattered enormously. But these establishments also became spaces where the official pieties could be questioned, where returning Crusaders could express their disillusionment with the whole enterprise. Imagine a group of veterans drinking together, their tongues loosened by ale, speaking truths that would be heretical in any other context. "We killed women and children in Jerusalem," one might confess. "The Saracens we fought were no more evil than us," another might admit. "The Pope promised us salvation, but I feel only damnation in my soul," a third might whisper. Such conversations were dangerous. If overheard by the wrong person, they could lead to charges of heresy, blasphemy, or treason. Yet the tavern provided a space where these thoughts could be spoken aloud, where the official narrative of the Crusades as a holy mission could be privately contested. The tavern keeper, hearing such talk, had to make a calculation. Would he report these men to the authorities, potentially earning a reward, but also losing customers and gaining a reputation as an informer, or would he keep their secrets, maintaining their trust, but risking his own neck if word got out? Most chose the latter option. The economics of the situation demanded it. A tavern that couldn't guarantee at least a modicum of discretion wouldn't stay in business long. This created a sort of unspoken social contract. Customers could speak more freely than they could elsewhere, but they also understood that if they went too far, or if the tavern keeper felt threatened, that protection could evaporate. The women who worked in these establishments occupied a particularly precarious position. Serving wenches were constantly subjected to unwanted advances from drunk customers who viewed them as fair game. Some tavern keepers protected their staff, recognizing that workers who felt safe were more loyal and effective. Others essentially pimped out their female employees, taking a cut of whatever transactions occurred. Then there were the professional prostitutes who worked out of taverns. In the Crusader-era, prostitution existed in a legal grey area. It was officially condemned by the church as sinful, but it was also widely tolerated as a necessary evil. St. Augustine had argued that prostitution was like a sewer in a palace, unpleasant but necessary to prevent worse corruption. This pragmatic approach meant that prostitution thrived in and around taverns, especially those located near military encampments or along major trade routes. These women provided not just sexual services but also companionship, entertainment, and emotional connection for men who were far from home. Some were remarkably skilled at extracting information from their clients, which they could then sell to interested parties. A prostitute might learn from a drunk merchant about a valuable shipment he was transporting, information that could be worth a small fortune to a gang of thieves. She might discover from a soldier details about troop movements that could be useful to the enemy. She might hear from a nobleman details about political intrigues that could be leveraged for blackmail. Violence was an ever-present reality in Crusader-era taverns. These were establishments frequented by men trained in warfare, men who had killed and seen death, men for whom violence was a first resort rather than a last one. Arguments over dice games, perceived insults, competition for women's attention, political disagreements, ethnic tensions, or simply the wrong look at the wrong moment, could escalate into bloodshed in seconds. The weapons available were limited by law and custom, but creativity and desperation could turn almost anything lethal. Knives were ubiquitous, carried by virtually everyone for eating and general utility. These weren't small pocket knives, but substantial blades capable of inflicting serious wounds. A skilled knife fighter could kill an opponent in seconds, while even an amateur could cause significant damage in the close quarters of a crowded tavern. Swords were less common, partly because they were expensive and partly because they were often restricted by law to members of the nobility and military. When swords did appear in tavern fights, the results were usually spectacular and bloody. The confined space made sword fighting particularly dangerous for bystanders, as wild swings could easily strike innocent customers or cause structural damage to the building. More commonly, fighters made do with improvised weapons. Wooden stools became clubs, pottery shards became cutting implements. Heavy pewter or wooden tankards could crush skulls or break bones with a single well-placed blow. Even eating utensils could be pressed into service as weapons in desperate circumstances. The fighting styles employed were brutal and practical, focused on ending conflicts quickly rather than demonstrating skill or following rules of chivalry. Grappling, gouging, biting and kicking were all acceptable tactics. Fighters often aimed for vulnerable areas like the eyes, throat and groin. The goal wasn't to wound or disable an opponent but to kill or incapacitate him before he could do the same to you. Group fights were particularly chaotic and dangerous. What might start as a dispute between two individuals could quickly escalate into a general melee involving dozens of people. Alliances formed and dissolved in seconds as customers chose sides based on personal relationships, ethnic loyalties, religious affiliations, or simple proximity to the action. In these situations, survival often depended more on luck than skill, as fighters struggled to avoid being overwhelmed by multiple opponents or struck by flying objects. The aftermath of tavern violence could be as dangerous as the violence itself. Wounded fighters might die from their injuries days or weeks later, turning what had seemed like a minor altercation into a case of murder. Families and friends of the injured or killed might seek revenge, creating cycles of violence that could persist for generations. Legal authorities might become involved, leading to trials, executions, or other forms of official punishment that could destroy entire families. Yet violence also served important social functions in Crusader-era taverns. It was a way of establishing and maintaining social hierarchies, with stronger or more skilled fighters earning respect and deference from their peers. It was a form of entertainment for spectators who might bet on the outcome of fights, or simply enjoy the excitement of watching others risk their lives. It was a method of dispute resolution in a society where formal legal mechanisms were often unavailable or ineffective. The tavern keepers themselves often had to resort to violence to maintain order. A strong tavern keeper who could personally handle troublemakers, or who employed enforcers to do so, could run a more profitable establishment than one who allowed chaos to reign. But this required a delicate balance. Too much violence would drive away customers and attract unwanted attention from authorities. Too little would result in the establishment becoming a free-for-all where nobody felt safe. As the Crusader era wore on and more Europeans gained experience with the wider world, taverns evolved into increasingly sophisticated spaces of commerce, crime, and conspiracy. They became places where East met West, where Christian met Muslim and Jew, where noble rubbed shoulders with commoner, and where the official narrative of a unified Christendom fighting for the Holy Land collided with the messy reality of human greed, ambition, and suffering. These establishments were the true heart of medieval society. Far more so than the castles of nobles or the cathedrals of bishops. They were where real people lived real lives, made real choices, and faced real consequences. They were spaces of possibility and danger, of opportunity and exploitation, of community and violence, and they set the template for 1,000 years of tavern culture that would spread across the world. The caravanserais, fortified oases of the Silk Road. Now let our journey take us east, to a very different kind of establishment that emerged around the same time as the Crusader-era taverns, but operated under completely different rules and assumptions. Picture yourself in the year 1229, standing before a massive stone structure rising from the Anatolian landscape. This is the Sultan Han near Aksaray, and it is unlike anything you'd find in Western Europe. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer scale of the building. Covering nearly 50,000 square feet, it's the largest medieval caravanserai in Turkey. High stone walls, smooth and devoid of decoration, except for the outlets for roof runoff, shaped like stylized animal heads, give it the appearance of a fortress, which in many ways it was. There are no windows, only one entrance, making it easily defensible against bandits and raiders. But step through that entrance, through the elaborately decorated main portal, with its bands of geometric design, Arabic inscriptions from the Quran, and intricate muqarnas stalactite vaulting, and you enter a different world entirely. A large courtyard opens before you, and at its center, raised on a stone platform, stands a small mosque. This is not just a place of business or refuge. This is a religious institution, a charitable foundation, a statement of power and piety by Sultan al-Adin Kaykubatis. The caravanserais of the Seljuk Empire represented a fundamentally different approach to hospitality than their European counterparts. These were state-funded establishments, built as pious endowments, designed to facilitate trade and demonstrate the power and generosity of the Sultan. They were spaced approximately 30 kilometers apart, about a day's journey on foot, or by camel caravan, along the major trade routes connecting Persia to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea to Anatolia. And here's the truly remarkable part. Everything was free. Travelers could stay for 3 days at no charge, receiving food, fodder for their animals, and lodging. This wasn't just humanitarian generosity, though that was certainly part of the motivation. This was strategic economic policy. By making travel safer and cheaper, the Seljuks encouraged trade, which in turn brought wealth to their empire through taxation and economic activity. The caravanserais were funded through waqf, a system of pious endowments that was central to Islamic governance. Wealthy individuals, including the Sultan himself, would set aside sources of income, often revenue from agricultural lands or commercial properties, to support the operation and maintenance of these establishments. This created a sustainable funding model that ensured the caravanserais could continue to operate without direct ongoing support from the state treasury. The organization of these buildings reflected both practical needs and Islamic architectural traditions. The courtyard, used in the summer months when the weather was pleasant, was surrounded by rooms along the walls. These rooms served various functions: lodging for travelers, storage for merchandise, quarters for guards, and stables for animals. The larger caravanserai also included baths, markets, kitchens, blacksmiths, and even infirmary. An adjoining covered hall provided protection during harsh Anatolian winters. The central aisle of this hall typically had a barrel-vaulted ceiling with transverse ribs and a short dome-capped tower over the center of the vault. This tower served both practical and aesthetic purposes, drawing hot air upward and letting in light while also demonstrating the sophistication of Seljuk architectural engineering. The accommodations, while basic by modern standards, were remarkably egalitarian. A wealthy merchant traveling with hundreds of camels and a poor pilgrim with nothing but a walking stick would receive the same treatment, reflecting Islamic principles of charity and the equal worth of all believers in the eyes of God. This stood in stark contrast to European inns, where your treatment directly corresponded to your ability to pay. But this egalitarian ideal existed alongside harsh realities. The Seljuk Empire, like any state, had enemies, both external and internal. The caravanserais, despite their charitable mission, were also fortified structures that could serve military purposes when necessary. Those high walls and single entrances that made them defensible against bandits also made them potential prisons or strongholds. And, beneath the surface of charitable hospitality, the caravanserais were sites of intense economic activity, and inevitably, of the crimes and conspiracies that follow wealth and opportunity. Merchants traveling the Silk Road were carrying goods worth fortunes, silks and spices and precious metals from the east, bound for markets in Europe. These caravans were tempting targets for thieves, and not all the thieves were outsiders. Staff members at caravanserais, despite the religious foundations and charitable purposes of these institutions, were still human, still susceptible to greed and temptation. A guard who knew which merchant was carrying gold coins might tip off a gang of thieves in exchange for a cut of the loot. A cook who had access to the storerooms might slip extra provisions to Confederates who would then sell them at a profit. An administrator responsible for record-keeping might accept bribes to falsify documents regarding customs duties or to provide information about valuable shipments. The free food and lodging also created opportunities for fraud. Travelers were entitled to 3 days of hospitality. But how did officials verify that someone hadn't already stayed at a caravanserai further along the road? Clever opportunists could potentially travel the entire length of the Seljuk Empire, staying at caravanserais the whole way, claiming to be different travelers at each location, essentially living for free indefinitely off the charitable foundation. More seriously, the caravanserais became sites of smuggling and black market commerce. Official trade routes were heavily taxed, with customs officials stationed at various points to collect duties on goods passing through. But merchants, being merchants, were always looking for ways to avoid these taxes. Caravanserais, with their storage rooms and relative privacy, became ideal locations for repackaging goods to hide their true nature or value, or for arranging illegal transfers between parties. The international nature of the trade routes meant that caravanserais brought together people from wildly different cultural and religious backgrounds. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and followers of various other faiths all traveled the Silk Road. While Islamic law provided the official legal framework for these establishments, in practice, a certain pragmatic tolerance prevailed. You couldn't run a successful caravanserai if you insisted on strict religious conformity. This created spaces where forbidden interactions could occur. Muslim men might drink alcohol purchased from Christian or Jewish merchants, violating Islamic prohibition against intoxicants. Women might travel with slightly more freedom than they enjoyed in settled areas, their faces uncovered, interacting with men who weren't their relatives, shocking more conservative travelers. Philosophical and religious discussions that might be dangerous in other contexts could take place under the relatively neutral space of the caravanserai. But this tolerance had limits. The managers of caravanserais were appointed by the foundations that funded them, and these foundations were ultimately responsible to religious authorities and the Sultan. If a caravanserai became known as a place where Islamic law was openly flouted, where heretical ideas were discussed, or where political sedition was being planned, intervention would be swift and harsh. The caravanserais also served as intelligence-gathering nodes for the Seljuk state. Travelers brought news from distant lands, information about political developments, military movements, economic conditions, and social unrest. Caravanserai managers were expected to report anything of significance to higher authorities. This created a network of information flow that allowed the central government to maintain awareness of conditions throughout their empire and beyond. This intelligence function made caravanserais potentially dangerous places for those with something to hide. A refugee fleeing political persecution might find temporary shelter in a caravanserai, but if word of their presence reached the wrong ears, that shelter could become a trap. A merchant carrying goods obtained through dubious means might feel safe within the walls of a caravanserai, only to be arrested when officials acting on information from the manager arrived. The architectural segregation of caravanserais, with separate areas for people and animals, also created spaces where different rules applied, the stables and storage areas being less directly supervised than the main living quarters, became sites for clandestine activities. Goods could be hidden among legitimate cargo. Secret meetings could take place while others were occupied elsewhere. Violence could occur out of sight of witnesses. The religious dimension of caravanserais added another layer of complexity. The small mosques at the center of courtyards, or built into walls above entrances, were meant to facilitate the 5 daily prayers required of Muslims, but they also served as gathering places where community formed, where travelers bonded over shared religious practice, and where informal social networks developed. These networks could be used for both legitimate and illegitimate purposes. Merchants might form partnerships and share information about market conditions, but the same networks could be used to organize criminal enterprises, to plan acts against the state, or to spread ideas that authorities considered dangerous. The contrast between the official charitable mission of caravanserais and the reality of what occurred within their walls reflects a fundamental tension in medieval Islamic society. On one hand, Islam placed great emphasis on charity, hospitality, and the equal treatment of all believers. On the other hand, the Seljuk Empire was a complex political and economic entity with hierarchies, conflicts, and competing interests that couldn't be resolved through piety alone. Consider the situation from the perspective of a Seljuk sultan. You've funded the construction of caravanserais to facilitate trade, demonstrate your piety, and strengthen your empire. You've appointed managers to oversee these establishments and ensure they fulfill their charitable mission. But you also need these same establishments to serve as intelligence-gathering nodes, as potential military strongpoints, and as symbols of your power and authority. This creates inherent contradictions. A manager who is too zealous in enforcing religious law might drive away non-Muslim traders, reducing trade and therefore reducing tax revenue. But a manager who is too lax might allow the caravanserai to become a den of iniquity, undermining its religious purpose and bringing shame to the foundation. Finding the balance required skill, judgment, and often a willingness to ignore things that officially shouldn't be ignored. The violence that occurred in and around caravanserais was somewhat different from that in European taverns. Travelers on the Silk Road came from warrior cultures, where honor and reputation mattered enormously, but they also came from different traditions with different codes of conduct. A conflict between a Turkish merchant and a Persian trader might escalate based on ethnic tensions. A dispute between a Muslim and a Christian over some trivial matter might become inflamed by religious animosity. The caravanserai managers had to be skilled at diffusing these tensions before they exploded into violence. They needed to understand the cultural backgrounds of their guests, to recognize when a situation was becoming dangerous, and to intervene in ways that didn't provoke further conflict. Some managers were ex-soldiers themselves, men who commanded respect through their own martial prowess. Others relied on diplomacy and mediation skills. When violence did occur, the response was typically swift and brutal. The Seljuk Empire had no tolerance for disorder, especially along the vital trade routes that were essential to its prosperity. Those who killed or seriously injured others in caravanserais could expect severe punishment, including execution. The bodies of executed criminals were sometimes displayed as warnings to others, a grim reminder that the Sultan's peace was not to be violated. Yet, even with these harsh penalties, crimes continued to occur. The potential rewards were simply too great, the opportunities too tempting, the human capacity for violence and greed too deeply ingrained. Caravanserais might have been conceived as charitable institutions, but they operated in a world where charity constantly collided with cupidity, where piety struggled against passion, where the ideals of Islamic hospitality confronted the realities of human nature. As the Seljuk Empire eventually declined and was succeeded by other powers, the caravanserai system evolved, but never entirely disappeared. The Ottomans maintained many of the old caravanserais and built new ones. The basic model spread across the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, adapting to local conditions, but maintaining the core principle of state-supported hospitality for travelers. And even as trade routes shifted and the Silk Road gradually lost its central importance, the legacy of the caravanserai endured. These establishments had demonstrated that it was possible to create a large-scale system of hospitality based on principles other than pure profit. They had shown that charity and commerce could coexist, that diverse peoples could be brought together in relatively safe and orderly spaces, that the state could play a positive role in facilitating economic and cultural exchange. But they had also revealed the limitations of such systems, the ways that even the most high-minded institutions could be corrupted by human weakness, the impossibility of creating perfect order in a chaotic world. The caravanserais were monuments to both the best and worst of medieval Islamic civilization, simultaneously embodying genuine hospitality and opportunistic exploitation, sincere piety and calculated power politics, peaceful coexistence and violent conflict. The Black Death, when plague transformed the tavern. Let us now return to Europe, but to a Europe transformed by catastrophe. The year is 3048, and death has arrived on the southern shores of England. The Black Death, the bubonic plague that would kill between 30 and 50% of Europe's population, is about to change everything, including the humble alehouse. Picture a small village in rural England before the plague. The alehouse is someone's home. Probably the home of a widow or a married woman whose husband works elsewhere. She brews ale several times a week, producing a cloudy, yeasty beverage that's safer to drink than water, and provides calories as well as mild intoxication. When she has ale ready, she hangs a stick or broom outside her door to let neighbors know. They come by, drink a cup or two, exchange gossip, and go about their business. It's informal, neighborly, barely commercial. Now, picture that same village in 1349. After the plague has passed through. Half the population is dead, buried in mass graves, or individual plots, hastily dug by overwhelmed survivors. The survivors are traumatized, grieving, and fundamentally changed, but something unexpected has happened. The economy hasn't collapsed. In fact, for those who survived, things have in some ways improved. The basic principle is simple. With half the population dead, there's suddenly more of everything to go around for those who remain. Land that was scarce is now available. Goods that were expensive are now cheaper because there are fewer buyers. Labor, which was abundant and therefore cheap, is now scarce and therefore valuable. Wages rise dramatically. A peasant who before the plague could barely scrape by now finds himself with disposable income, a concept that would have been alien to his parents' generation. And what does this peasant do with his newfound wealth and leisure time? He drinks. He drinks better ale, more ale, and he drinks it not just at home, but in the alehouse, which is no longer just someone's kitchen, but is becoming a dedicated commercial establishment. The alewife who survived the plague finds herself with more customers who can pay more money, and she invests in expanding her operation. She might add rooms, brew more varieties of ale, offer simple food. She's becoming a businesswoman, not just a neighbor who happens to brew. But it's more than just economics. The psychological impact of the plague cannot be overstated. Imagine watching half the people you know die in the most horrible ways possible. Bubonic plague caused agonizing boils and abscesses, pustules on the legs and under the armpits, fever, pain, and a horrifying darkening of the skin due to internal bleeding. Victims suffered for days before dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to help them. The survivors needed to make sense of this catastrophe, and the explanations available were terrifying. The church said it was God's punishment for sin, which implied that more punishment might be coming if people didn't repent. Doctors, with their primitive understanding of disease, offered useless or actively harmful advice. Some said to avoid fruits and vegetables, others said to drink plenty of wine to prevent infection. Some recommended bloodletting, which probably killed more people than it saved. In this atmosphere of trauma and uncertainty, the alehouse took on new significance. It became a space where people could temporarily escape their grief and fear. Alcohol provided a chemical respite from psychological pain, dulling the memories of watching loved ones die. The social aspect was equally important, gathering with other survivors, sharing stories, expressing emotions that had no other outlet. All of this was therapeutic in ways that medieval people couldn't articulate, but instinctively understood. Interestingly, drinking alcohol was not just socially acceptable during plague outbreaks, but was actually medically recommended. Contemporary doctors and medical writers believed that moderate consumption of beer, wine, and spirits helped prevent plague infection. The theory was that alcohol strengthened the body's key defensive organs, the heart, liver, and brain. Many medical authorities recommended drinking fortified liquors first thing in the morning, plague breakfasts that would supposedly ward off infection. There was also a psychological component to this medical advice. Doctors recognized that fear and melancholy made people more susceptible to disease, or so they believed. Alcohol was seen as a way to make the heart merry and cause cheerfulness, thereby fortifying the body's defenses. As one physician wrote, drinking good liquor would banish many enormous ideas of fear, hatred, anxiousness, sorrow, and other perplexing thoughts, and fortify the balsam of life against all infectious breaths. Of course, the key word was moderate. Excessive drinking to the point of drunkenness was still cautioned against, but the line between moderate and excessive was often blurred, especially in a tavern environment where peer pressure and the numbing effects of alcohol itself made it difficult to stop. The plague also created new opportunities for criminal activity in and around alehouses. With so many people dead, property sat unclaimed. Goods were left in homes whose entire families had been wiped out. Documents establishing ownership were lost or destroyed. In this chaos, the unscrupulous could profit enormously. Alewives and tavern keepers often served as fences for stolen goods. A thief who had looted a plague-emptied house needed somewhere to sell his ill-gotten gains, and tavern keepers were often willing to purchase items without asking uncomfortable questions. They could then resell these goods to travelers who wouldn't know they were stolen, or use them in their own establishments. The plague also disrupted law enforcement. Many constables, bailiffs, and other officials died, and their replacements were often less experienced or less honest. Court systems were overwhelmed with cases involving disputed inheritances and property claims. In this environment, crimes that might have been prosecuted vigorously before the plague often went unpunished. Prostitution, always present in tavern culture, expanded significantly in the post-plague era. The reasons were complex. Many women had lost their husbands and had no other means of support. The traditional path for such women might have been remarriage, but with so many single women and relatively fewer men, remarriage wasn't always possible. Prostitution offered a way to survive. At the same time, demand for sexual services increased. Men who had survived the plague and found themselves suddenly wealthier wanted to enjoy their newfound prosperity. The awareness of mortality that the plague instilled led to a live-for-today mentality that manifested in increased spending on pleasure, including the services of prostitutes. The taverns themselves evolved architecturally in response to these changes. The simple one-room alehouses of the pre-plague era expanded into multi-room establishments with upstairs sleeping quarters, private rooms for discreet meetings or assignations, and larger common areas to accommodate more customers. Some entrepreneurs began combining the functions of alehouse, tavern, and inn, offering food, drink, and lodging all under one roof. This evolution blurred the previously distinct categories of drinking establishments. An alehouse that began offering rooms became an inn. A tavern that started brewing its own ale, instead of just selling wine, began to look like an alehouse. The result was the emergence of a new type of establishment that would eventually be called a public house or pub, a term that perfectly captured its function as a communal space for the local population. The guild system that had begun to organize tavern keepers before the plague strengthened considerably afterward. These guilds regulated prices, maintained quality standards, and protected members from competition. They also provided mutual aid for members and their families, a form of insurance that was particularly valuable in the uncertain post-plague world. But guilds also facilitated corruption. Guild members might collude to fix prices, create artificial scarcity to drive up profits, or use their collective influence to pressure officials into overlooking violations of regulations. The close relationships between guild members also made it easier to organize criminal enterprises. The increased commercialization of brewing brought women into a more prominent role in the economy. Alewives, who had run small-scale operations from their homes, found themselves managing substantial businesses. Some became wealthy and influential in their communities. This represented a degree of economic independence for women that was unusual in medieval society. However, this newfound prominence also made alewives targets for suspicion and persecution. Brewing involved processes that could seem mysterious to the uninitiated. Fermentation, the production of alcohol from grain, water, and wild yeast. In an era when magic and superstition were part of everyday life, this process could be viewed with suspicion. Some alewives were accused of witchcraft, particularly if their ale was unusually good, or if they were otherwise unpopular in their communities. The regulation of ale became more systematic in the post-plague era. Officials called ale-testers, or ale conners, were appointed to ensure that ale met quality standards and was sold at fair prices. These officials had the power to fine or punish alewives who violated the regulations. In theory, this protected consumers from fraud and exploitation. In practice, it created opportunities for corruption, as ale-testers could be bribed to overlook violations, or could use their authority to harass honest brewers. Punishments for brewing bad ale or charging excessive prices were severe and public. Male brewers found guilty of such offences might be locked in the pillory, a wooden framework that held the offender's head and hands, exposing them to public ridicule and sometimes physical abuse from angry customers. Female brewers faced the cucking stool or trebuchet, a device that repeatedly dunked the offender in the nearest body of water. These punishments served both as deterrent and entertainment, with crowds gathering to watch the spectacle. The violence that had always been present in tavern culture intensified in the post-plague era. The trauma of the plague, combined with increased wealth, increased alcohol consumption, and a general loosening of social bonds, created volatile conditions. Fights broke out more frequently, and were often more brutal than before. The authorities' response to tavern violence was inconsistent. In theory, murder was a capital crime regardless of where it occurred. In practice, many tavern killings went unpunished, especially if the victim was someone of low social standing and the perpetrator had money or connections. The overwhelmed legal system simply couldn't process all the cases that came before it. This sense of impunity encouraged further violence. If a man could kill someone in a tavern brawl and face no consequences, what deterrent was there against doing so again? The taverns of post-plague Europe became genuinely dangerous places where a wrong word or look could be fatal. Yet, despite all the crime, violence, and exploitation, the taverns and alehouses of post-plague Europe served a vital social function. They were spaces where traumatized people could gather, where communities could begin to heal, where the bonds broken by the plague could be reformed. They weren't pretty or sanitized spaces, but they were real, they were human, and they were necessary. The Black Death had transformed European tavern culture forever, turning what had been informal, small-scale operations into commercial enterprises, creating the template for what would become the British pub, and establishing patterns of drinking, socializing, and crime that would persist for centuries. Out of catastrophe came change, and that change, for all its darkness, also contained the seeds of something new. Ottoman bozahouses, fermented grain and forbidden pleasures. Now let us travel east again, to the city of Istanbul, in the 16th century, the heart of the Ottoman Empire. But we're not going to a tavern or an inn in the European sense. We're going to enter a bozahhouse, a uniquely Ottoman institution that served a uniquely Ottoman drink. Picture yourself walking through the narrow streets of 16th century Istanbul. The city is a metropolis of nearly 1 million people, a global center of trade and culture where East truly meets West. The air is filled with the calls of street vendors, the sounds of a dozen different languages, the smells of spices and smoke, and humanity pressed together in dense urban quarters. You see a building with a modest entrance, but as you approach, the distinct aroma tells you exactly what this place is. This is a bozahhouse. Boza is a fermented grain beverage made from wheat, millet, or bulgur. It has ancient roots stretching back to the Sumerians and Hittites. But the Ottomans perfected it, creating two distinct types. Sweet boza had very little alcohol content, and was permissible under Islamic law. It was thick, slightly sour, nutritious, and considered appropriate for family consumption. A glass of sweet boza with cinnamon sprinkled on top, and roasted chickpeas on the side was a winter treat enjoyed by people from all social classes. But then there was sour boza, sometimes called Tatar boza, after the ethnic groups who were particularly skilled at making it. This version had an alcohol content that rivaled wine. According to the 17th century Ottoman traveller Ivliya Çelebi, The fermented boza from Crimea was so strong that a single glass would cause a man to burst into song. This was the boza that drew men to bozahouses, not for its nutritional value, but for its intoxicating effects. The distinction between sweet and sour boza created a legal and social ambiguity that the bozahouses exploited brilliantly. Officially, establishments were licensed to sell only sweet boza, but many kept supplies of sour boza available under the counter for customers in the know. This created a wink and nod situation where everyone understood what was really happening, but as long as appearances were maintained, authorities generally looked the other way. This wasn't just about drinking. The bozahouses served important social functions. In the 16th century they were frequented primarily by the upper classes, the ulema, religious scholars, and men of letters, who came as much for the conversation and companionship as for the boza itself. These establishments were known for serving excellent food, particularly succulent kebabs and fried liver, alongside their signature beverage. But by the 17th century, bozahouses had become more inclusive, bringing together the ulema and flower porters, as Chelebi noted. They had evolved into spaces where social hierarchies were somewhat relaxed, where a wealthy merchant might find himself sitting next to a dock worker, where ideas could be exchanged between people who would never normally interact. This made bozahouses attractive to authorities for intelligence gathering, but also threatening as potential spaces for political dissent. The Ottoman state had a complicated relationship with these establishments. On one hand, they generated tax revenue and served a popular demand. On the other hand, they were spaces where uncontrolled gatherings occurred, where alcohol might be consumed in violation of Islamic law, and where seditious ideas might be discussed. Various sultans attempted to crack down on bozahouses over the centuries. Murad III banned the sale of boza in the late 16th century. Murad III went even further in the early 17th century, ordering the closure of all bozahouses and coffeehouses, viewing them as threats to public order and religious piety. But these prohibitions were never fully effective. Economic incentives to keep the bozahouses open were too strong, both for the entrepreneurs who ran them and for the officials who taxed them. The repeated cycles of prohibition and tolerance created a culture of corruption around bozahouses. Owners paid bribes to officials to stay open during crackdowns. Customers paid premiums for sour boza during periods when it was officially banned. Informers were rewarded for reporting violations, but could also be bribed into silence. The whole system ran on money exchanging hands under tables, creating opportunities for wealth but also for exploitation and injustice. Women's relationship with bozahouses was complex. These were spaces primarily for men, reflecting the gender segregation that characterized Ottoman society. Respectable women generally did not enter bozahouses. However, women were sometimes involved in boza production, and some women ran bozahouses, though they typically employed men to serve customers. The women who did work in bozahouses occupied a precarious social position. They weren't quite prostitutes, but they weren't quite respectable either. Their presence in a male space, serving alcohol, made them targets for harassment and created assumptions about their availability for sexual services. Some bozahouse owners essentially pimped out their female employees, while others tried to protect them, recognizing that workers who felt safe were more loyal and effective. The violence in bozahouses followed patterns similar to those in European taverns, but with some distinctly Ottoman characteristics. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic state encompassing Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, Slavs, and numerous other groups. These ethnic tensions could explode in bozahouses, particularly when alcohol was involved. Religious differences added another layer of potential conflict. While Muslims made up the majority of the population and bozahouses were officially Islamic institutions, Christians and Jews also lived in Istanbul, and sometimes frequented these establishments. A drunk Muslim might take offense at a Christian's presence or vice versa. Arguments about theological differences could escalate into physical violence. The Janissaries, the elite military force of the Ottoman Empire, were particularly notorious for their involvement in bozahouse culture. Many Janissaries opened their own bozahouses, running them more like organized crime operations than legitimate businesses. These Janissary bozahouses were essentially off-limits to regular law enforcement, as the Janissaries themselves were powerful enough to resist attempts to regulate them. Janissary bozahouses became centers of various illegal activities. Stolen goods were fenced through them. Protection rackets were organized from them. Political conspiracies were hatched in their back rooms. The Janissaries' military power made their bozahouses dangerous places for anyone foolish enough to cross them, but also popular destinations for those seeking a taste of danger and the truly forbidden. The relationship between bozahouses and coffeehouses is particularly interesting. Coffeehouses, which began appearing in Istanbul in the mid-16th century, competed with bozahouses for customers. Coffee had the advantage of being clearly permissible under Islamic law, and had the backing of the ulema. Coffeehouses also developed their own culture of intellectual discussion, poetry recitation, and shadow puppet shows. But coffeehouses faced many of the same suspicions from authorities that bozahouses did. They too were spaces where people gathered, where ideas were exchanged, where political opinions could be expressed. The fact that both institutions faced periodic crackdowns suggests that the real concern wasn't about alcohol or specific beverages, but about uncontrolled public spaces themselves. The bozahouses also served as sites of economic crime. Istanbul was a major commercial center, and merchants passing through the city carried valuable goods and large amounts of money. A merchant who got drunk in a bozahouse might reveal information about his cargo or his route, information that could be worth a fortune to thieves. He might be robbed directly, either by other customers or by the bozahouse staff themselves, or he might be cheated in various ways, overcharged for boza, sold adulterated goods, or tricked into fraudulent business deals. The adulteration of boza was a persistent problem. Unscrupulous bozahouse operators might water down their product or add cheaper ingredients to increase their profits. Officials conducted periodic inspections, and those caught selling bad boza faced fines and public humiliation, but the potential profits made the risk worthwhile for some. The location of bozahouses within the urban geography of Istanbul was significant. They tended to cluster in certain neighborhoods, particularly those associated with trade and commerce. This made strategic sense, as merchants and traders were prime customers, but it also created zones within the city where social control was weaker, where the normal rules of Ottoman society were somewhat relaxed. These neighborhoods developed their own cultures and reputations. Some became known as places where foreigners gathered, where different languages were spoken, where strange customs were tolerated. Others became associated with particular ethnic groups or religious communities. The bozahouses in these areas reflected and reinforced these neighborhood identities. As Ottoman power began to decline in the 19th century, the bozahouses faced increasing competition from European-style beer halls and taverns. The sour boza that had attracted customers for centuries became less popular as wine and liqueur, a grape-based, anise-flavored spirit, became cheaper and more accessible. The old bozahouses began to close or transform into different types of establishments. But the sweet boza tradition survived. A few famous bozahouses, like Vefa Bozahouses, founded in 1876, continued to serve sweet boza as a cultural tradition and tourist attraction. These establishments became living museums, preserving a taste of Ottoman Istanbul, even as the city modernized around them. The legacy of the bozahouses extends beyond their physical presence. They represented a uniquely Ottoman approach to the tensions between religious law, popular culture, and state power. They showed how institutions could exist in legal grey areas, officially forbidden but practically tolerated, creating spaces where people could cuss against social constraints without completely breaking them. The bozahouses also demonstrated the impossibility of completely controlling public spaces, no matter how authoritarian the regime. The Ottoman sultans could ban boza, close bozahouses, and punish violators, but they couldn't eliminate the human desire to gather, to drink, to socialize, and to sometimes defy authority. The bozahouses kept reopening, kept serving sour boza under the counter, kept providing spaces where the official version of Ottoman society collided with messy reality. In this way, the bozahouses were not so different from the taverns of Crusader Europe or the pirate havens we'll visit next. They were all spaces where the rules that governed society elsewhere were bent if not broken, where human appetites and ambitions were given freer rein, and where the underground currents of history flowed more visibly. They were places where you could see, if you looked closely enough, the real workings of power, crime, and human nature. Caribbean pirate havens, the wickedest ports on earth. Now we leave the old world behind entirely and sail across the Atlantic to the Caribbean in the 17th and early 18th centuries, to what historians call the Golden Age of piracy. We're going to visit two legendary pirate havens, Port Royal on Jamaica and Tortuga off the coast of Haiti. These were places where the tavern culture we've been exploring reached its most extreme, most violent, and most spectacular expression. Let's begin with Port Royal. Picture yourself approaching the city from the sea in 1680. What you see is staggering. This is one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the English colonies. With nearly 10,000 inhabitants crammed into just 51 acres, the harbour is filled with ships, over 200 of them in 1688 alone. The waterfront is lined with buildings, warehouses, shops, and above all, taverns. At the height of its prosperity, Port Royal had one drinking establishment for every 10 residents. Let that sink in for a moment. In July 1661 alone, 40 new tavern licenses were granted. This was a city built on rum, plunder, and sin. Contemporaries called it the Sodom of the New World and the wickedest city on earth. And for once, the hyperbole was justified. How did Port Royal become this way? The story begins with English imperial strategy. When England seized Jamaica from Spain in 1655, they faced a problem. They didn't have enough troops to defend the island against Spanish counterattacks or attacks from other European powers. The solution was brilliant in its cynicism. Invite pirates to use Port Royal as their base of operations in exchange for defending the city. The pirates accepted eagerly. Port Royal offered everything a buccaneer could want. A protected harbour that could hold up to 500 ships, a strategic location in the middle of Caribbean shipping lanes, and most importantly, a government that not only tolerated piracy, but actively encouraged it. This wasn't some lawless frontier settlement. This was state-sponsored piracy, with the governor himself issuing commissions to captains who would attack Spanish shipping and share the loot with the English crown. The most famous of these state-sponsored pirates was Sir Henry Morgan, a Welsh captain who used Port Royal as his base for a series of spectacularly successful and brutal raids on Spanish colonial cities. Morgan sacked Portobello in Panama, Maracaibo in Venezuela, and Panama City itself. He became fabulously wealthy, and in 1675 he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, a clear signal that piracy, when directed against England's enemies, was not just acceptable, but rewarded. The wealth that flowed into Port Royal from these piratical raids was staggering. Spanish gold and silver, looted from ships and cities, poured into the port. Merchants arrived to sell goods to pirates who had more money than they knew what to do with. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of almost unbelievable excess. Pirates would buy a pipe of wine, a large cask containing about 26 gallons, place it in the street, and force everyone who passed to drink from it. One pirate reportedly paid 500 pieces of 8 silver coins worth roughly a month's wages for a skilled worker, just to see a prostitute naked. The taverns of Port Royal catered to this debauchery with enthusiasm. They offered rum, wine, and beer in quantities that defied belief. They provided prostitutes for men who had been at sea for months. They hosted gambling games, where fortunes changed hands on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. They were spaces where any pleasure could be purchased, any appetite satisfied, any desire fulfilled, as long as you had the money. The descriptions from contemporary observers are both fascinating and horrifying. Charles Leslie, who wrote a history of Jamaica, described how pirates have been known to spend 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of 8 in one night. This was money earned through violence and theft, often involving the torture and murder of Spanish sailors and colonists, now being squandered on alcohol and prostitutes. The women who worked in Port Royal's taverns came from diverse backgrounds. Some were prostitutes who had travelled from Europe or other colonies specifically to service the pirate trade. Others were local women, slaves, former slaves, or indigenous people who had few other options for survival. Still others were pirates themselves, women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who dressed as men and fought alongside male pirates. The taverns themselves varied in quality and character. The better establishments offered relatively comfortable accommodations, decent food, and some semblance of order. The worst were little more than shacks, where murder was a nightly occurrence, and the rum was often adulterated with water or worse. But all of them shared certain characteristics. They were loud, they were violent, and they operated with almost complete impunity. The crimes that occurred in and around these taverns went far beyond simple drunken brawls. Pirates would attack and rob other pirates. Prostitutes would drug and steal from their clients. Tavern owners would collude with thieves to target wealthy patrons. Murder was so common that it barely rated mention unless the victim was someone of importance. The legal system in Port Royal was a joke. There were courts and judges, but they were thoroughly corrupted by pirate money. A pirate who committed murder could usually avoid punishment by bribing the right officials, or simply leaving town until the heat died down. The only pirates who faced serious legal consequences were those who attacked English ships or otherwise crossed powerful interests. But in 1692, divine judgment arrived. Or so it seemed to contemporary observers. On June 7th, a massive earthquake struck Port Royal. The ground liquefied beneath the city, and much of Port Royal, including most of the waterfront with its taverns and warehouses, slid into the sea. Thousands died. The survivors saw it as God's punishment for the city's wickedness. Port Royal never fully recovered its former glory. Kingston emerged as Jamaica's primary city, but the legend of Port Royal as the wickedest city on earth, and its taverns, as the wildest and most dangerous in history, has endured. Now let's sail north to Tortuga, the island off the coast of Haiti that became synonymous with piracy. If Port Royal was the metropolis of piracy, Tortuga was its frontier outpost, rougher, more lawless, and in some ways even more dangerous. Tortuga's history as a pirate haven began in the 1630s when French hunters called buccaneers, the name coming from their method of curing meat, fled there from Hispaniola to escape Spanish settlers. These men discovered that piracy was more profitable than hunting, and Tortuga's protected harbour and location near major shipping routes made it an ideal base for operations. The island's governor, Jean Levasseur, recognized the economic potential of hosting pirates and built a fortress to defend the harbour. Tortuga became a magnet for pirates, buccaneers, smugglers, and all manner of criminals from across Europe and the Americas. It was a place, as one contemporary described it, where the tides seemed to have swept together the sum of pirates, privateers, prostitutes, thieves, and drunkards. The taverns of Tortuga made those of Port Royal look almost civilized by comparison. These were primitive structures with dirt floors, leaking roofs and furnishings that consisted of whatever could be scavenged or stolen, but they served potent rum and provided women, which was all the pirates really wanted. The most famous tavern on Tortuga was the Faithful Bride, which became legendary in pirate lore. This was where pirates gathered to celebrate successful raids, to plan new ventures, to drink themselves into oblivion, and to fight. The Faithful Bride saw more violence in a single night than most modern cities see in a year. The culture of Tortuga was shaped by the Brethren of the Coast, a loose fraternity of pirates that developed its own code of conduct. This code governed how plunder would be divided, how disputes would be settled, and what behaviors were acceptable. But acceptable in this context meant something very different from acceptable in civilized society. Murder was fine as long as it was for a good reason. Theft from other pirates was punishable by death or marooning. Rape was theoretically forbidden but probably common in practice. The pirates of Tortuga came from diverse backgrounds. There were English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish pirates. There were escaped slaves and indigenous people. There were men running from the law, fleeing religious persecution, escaping poverty, or simply seeking adventure. What united them was a rejection of the rules and hierarchies of normal society and a willingness to use violence to take what they wanted. The taverns were where these diverse groups mingled, and the results were often explosive. Language barriers, ethnic prejudices, religious differences, and simple drunken aggression led to constant fighting. Knives flashed in candlelight, bottles were smashed over heads, men grappled in the mud outside. The strong survived and prospered. The weak died and were forgotten. Gambling in Tortuga's taverns was particularly vicious. Pirates would wager everything they owned on a single throw of dice, on a game of cards, on which of two cockroaches would reach a piece of food first. Some pirates would find themselves destitute the day after returning from a successful raid. Having gambled away their entire share of the plunder, these men would then be forced to sign onto another pirate ship, often under worse terms than before, beginning the cycle again. Prostitution in Tortuga operated with even fewer protections than in other ports. The women were often slaves or former slaves, prisoners captured in raids, or desperately poor women who had no other options. They were used, abused, and discarded. Some formed relationships with individual pirates that offered a degree of protection. But these arrangements were precarious and could be dissolved at any moment. The French authorities nominally controlled Tortuga, but their control was more theoretical than real. The pirates were too numerous and too well armed to be easily controlled. Governors learned to take a pragmatic approach, taxing pirate activity rather than trying to suppress it, and using the pirates as a de facto defense force against Spanish incursions. This arrangement worked until piracy itself became less profitable and more risky. As European navies grew stronger and anti-piracy measures became more effective, the golden age of piracy came to an end. Tortuga declined, and eventually, the pirates disappeared. Some hanged, some settled into respectability, some simply vanished into history. But during its heyday, Tortuga represented the absolute extreme of tavern culture. These establishments weren't just tolerating crime and vice. They were built on crime and vice. They weren't merely spaces where the normal rules were bent. They were spaces where the normal rules didn't exist at all. They were pure chaos, pure freedom, and pure danger. The legacy of these pirate taverns has been romanticized beyond all recognition by popular culture. Modern depictions show cheerful rogues, singing sea shanties and having jolly adventures. The reality was far darker. These were places of genuine horror, where human life was cheap, where cruelty was common, and where suffering was ignored or celebrated. Yet there's something compelling about them nonetheless. These taverns represented a rejection of the increasingly rigid social hierarchies and religious restrictions of the era. They were spaces where a former slave could become a captain, where a peasant could become wealthy, where the son of a nobleman and the son of a farmer were equals because they both had the courage to risk everything. The pirate taverns of the Caribbean were the last gasp of a kind of freedom that was disappearing from the world. As nation-states grew stronger, as law enforcement became more effective, as civilization in the European sense spread across the globe, spaces like Port Royal and Tortuga became impossible. They couldn't survive in a world of professional navies, international treaties, and coordinated law enforcement. But for a brief, bloody moment in history, they existed, and their taverns were the absolute pinnacle of a tradition that stretched back 1,000 years, from the Crusader-era inns of Europe to the caravanserais of the Silk Road, from the plague-era alehouses to the bozahouses of Istanbul, and finally to these pirate havens. We can trace the evolution of the tavern as a space where official society and underground society met, clashed, and somehow coexisted. Crimes and conspiracies, the shadow economy of the tavern. Now that we've toured the world of medieval and early modern taverns, let's examine more systematically the criminal enterprises that operated within and around these establishments. Because across all the different cultures and time periods we've explored, certain patterns of crime emerge consistently. Taverns weren't just places where crime occasionally happened, they were integral parts of criminal infrastructure. Let's start with smuggling, perhaps the most economically significant crime associated with taverns throughout this 1,000-year period. Every government in every time and place we've discussed wanted to control trade and extract revenue through taxes, customs duties, and monopolies. And in every case, merchants and criminals worked together to evade these controls, and taverns were central to their operations. In Crusader-era Europe, taverns served as meeting points where smugglers could connect with merchants willing to purchase goods that had been brought into the country without paying customs duties. A tavern near a port might see ships' crews unloading valuable cargo at night, then bringing it to the tavern where local merchants would purchase it at below-market prices, no questions asked. The tavern keeper would take a cut for facilitating the transaction and for keeping quiet about what he'd witnessed. The same pattern repeated in Ottoman Istanbul, where taverns and bozahouses served as clearinghouses for goods that had been smuggled past customs officials. The vast trade networks of the Silk Road created endless opportunities for smuggling. Goods declared as low-value items to minimize taxes could be sold at their true value through tavern connections. Goods that were supposed to be sold only through official monopolies could find their way to black market buyers through tavern intermediaries. In the Caribbean pirate havens, smuggling was practically the official business model. The entire economy of Port Royal and Tortuga was based on moving stolen goods from pirates to merchants. The taverns were where these transactions were negotiated, where prices were set, where deals were sealed with handshakes and drinks. The line between piracy and smuggling was often blurred, as pirates would sometimes purchase stolen goods from other pirates, creating a layered black market economy. But smuggling was just one aspect of a much larger criminal ecosystem. Taverns served as headquarters for organized crime in ways that wouldn't be out of place in a modern crime drama. Consider how a criminal organization might operate in, say, 14th century London. The leader might be a tavern keeper himself, using his legitimate business as cover for his criminal activities. He would employ a network of thieves, each specializing in different types of theft. Some might focus on picking pockets in crowded markets. Others might break into homes and businesses. Still others might rob travelers on the roads leading into the city. These thieves would bring their stolen goods to the tavern, where the tavern keeper would purchase them at a fraction of their value. He would then resell these goods, either to legitimate merchants who weren't too careful about provenance, or to travelers passing through, who wouldn't be around if questions were later asked. The tavern provided both a ready market for stolen goods and a legitimate reason for large amounts of money to change hands. The tavern keeper might also run protection rackets, using the threat of violence to extract payments from other businesses in the area. The violent criminals he employed for this purpose would naturally hang around the tavern, drinking and gambling when not out collecting protection money, or beating up people who refused to pay. This model repeated itself across cultures and time periods. Janissary coffeehouses in Istanbul operated as organized crime headquarters in exactly this way. Pirate taverns in the Caribbean functioned as clearinghouses for stolen goods. On a scale that made European operations look quaint by comparison, the Seljuk caravanserais, despite their charitable foundations, sometimes became sites where criminal organizations operated, though the stronger central authority of the Seljuk state kept this somewhat more under control than in Europe or the Caribbean. Political conspiracy was another common tavern crime, and potentially the most dangerous. Taverns were natural gathering places for political dissidents, whether they were plotting against the local lord, the distant king, or the entire social order. The combination of privacy, alcohol, and passionate conversation could turn a grumbling about taxes into a plot to overthrow the government. The English peasants' revolt of 3081 began with meetings in taverns and alehouses, where disgruntled peasants discussed their grievances against the nobility and the crown. Many major rebellions and uprisings throughout medieval history had their origins in tavern conversations that escalated into action. The authorities understood this, which is why taverns were often the first places to be shut down when political tensions rose. In Ottoman Istanbul, coffeehouses and bozahouses were notorious centers of political discussion and potential sedition. The sultans repeatedly tried to close them down for exactly this reason. Government spies frequented these establishments to eavesdrop on conversations and identify potential troublemakers. But the very ubiquity of these spaces made complete surveillance impossible. For every spy listening in, there were dozens of other conversations happening that went unmonitored. The caravanserais, despite being state-sponsored institutions, also sometimes became sites of political plotting. Travelers from distant provinces might meet in a caravanserai and discuss rebellion against the Sultan. Merchants might share information about government corruption or military weakness. Even the most authoritarian state couldn't completely control what people said in private conversations. Fraud and confidence schemes were yet another category of tavern crime, and one that took many creative forms. A common scam involved loaded or shaved dice that looked normal but were weighted to produce certain outcomes more frequently. A skilled dice cheat could clean out less sophisticated gamblers before they realized they were being cheated. Card cheating was even more elaborate, involving marked decks, dealing from the bottom, sleight of hand, and collaboration between multiple cheaters who would signal each other about their hands. The best card cheats could take all of a victim's money while making it look like simple bad luck. But the most sophisticated frauds involved more than just gambling. A group of criminals might identify a wealthy merchant traveling alone and set up an elaborate con. One would befriend the merchant in the tavern, gaining his trust. Another would appear to be an even wealthier merchant, looking for a business partner. They would arrange a deal that seemed enormously profitable, convincing the victim to invest his capital. By the time he realized the whole thing was a scam, the criminals would be long gone with his money. These fraud operations required careful planning, good acting skills, and often the cooperation of the tavern keeper, who would vouch for the criminal's credibility or look the other way when the scam was being executed. The victim, embarrassed by his gullibility and unsure who to trust in a strange city, often wouldn't even report the crime. Counterfeiting was another profitable tavern crime. Coins could be clipped, shaved to remove precious metal, while still passing as legitimate currency. Copper coins could be plated with silver or gold, to appear more valuable than they were. False documents could be forged, creating fake contracts, letters of credit, or official papers. Taverns were ideal places to pass counterfeit money, because transactions happened quickly, often in dim lighting, and involved people who were drunk and therefore less careful about inspecting their money. The skilled counterfeiter could spend fake coins in a tavern, receive real coins in change, and be gone before anyone realized what had happened. Kidnapping and human trafficking also had connections to tavern culture. Pirates would sometimes sell their captives to tavern keepers, who would force them to work as slaves until they could pay off their debt for food and lodging. Women and children were particularly vulnerable to this form of exploitation. In some cases, tavern keepers would specifically target vulnerable individuals. A young woman arriving alone in a city, looking for work, might be lured into a tavern with promises of employment, only to find herself essentially imprisoned and forced into prostitution. A young man looking for adventure might be drugged and wake up aboard a ship, having been press-ganged into a pirate crew. The legal system's response to all these crimes varied enormously based on time, place, and the social status of the people involved. In general, though, tavern crimes were under-prosecuted and under-punished. The authorities were often overwhelmed, corrupt, or simply didn't care that much about crimes that mostly affected other criminals or people of low social status. When prosecutions did happen, the punishments could be spectacular and brutal. Public executions, floggings, brandings, and mutilations sent messages about the consequences of crime. But these messages were often ineffective. For every criminal who was caught and punished, dozens more continued to operate with impunity. The economic logic was simple. The potential rewards of tavern crime far outweighed the risks. A successful smuggling operation could make you rich. A well-executed fraud could set you up for life. Even simple theft, repeated consistently, could provide a decent living, and the chances of being caught were relatively low, especially if you were smart about it. Moreover, many tavern crimes existed in moral grey areas where even the victims weren't entirely sympathetic. If a merchant was cheated at cards, well, he shouldn't have been gambling in the first place. If someone bought smuggled goods at below market prices, they were complicit in the crime. If a drunk fool was robbed after bragging about his wealth, perhaps he deserved it for his lack of prudence. This moral ambiguity extended to the authorities themselves. Officials who were supposed to be enforcing the law were often customers at the same taverns where crimes were being committed. They might even be participating in the criminal activities. A constable who took bribes to overlook smuggling, a judge who accepted payoffs to dismiss cases, a tax collector who skimmed from his receipts and spent his ill-gotten gains in taverns. The line between law enforcement and criminality was often invisible. The taverns themselves were usually protected by a combination of bribery, intimidation, and the simple fact that shutting them down would create more problems than it solved. A tavern that facilitated criminal activity also provided valuable intelligence to authorities, as tavern keepers often informed on their customers when it suited their interests. A tavern that employed prostitutes also kept those women off the streets, where their presence might be more disruptive. A tavern that hosted gambling provided a release valve for violent impulses that might otherwise be directed at more respectable targets. This utilitarian approach to tavern crime characterized most pre-modern societies. Complete elimination of vice and crime was understood to be impossible, so the focus was on management and containment. Let the criminals have their taverns, as long as they don't get too out of control. Let the prostitutes work there, as long as they're discreet. Let the gambling happen, as long as it doesn't bankrupt too many people too visibly. But this approach had its limits. When tavern crime became too blatant, when it started to affect powerful people or threaten public order in obvious ways, crackdowns would happen. Taverns would be raided, criminals arrested, examples made, but these crackdowns were usually temporary. The underlying economic and social factors that made tavern crime profitable and difficult to eliminate remained unchanged. The result was a perpetual cat-and-mouse game between criminals and authorities, with the tavern as the primary battleground. This game played out across 1,000 years of history, from medieval Europe to the Ottoman Empire to the Caribbean, with variations in details but remarkable consistency in basic patterns. Forbidden activities and secret transactions. Beyond the crimes we've already discussed, taverns across this 1,000-year history hosted activities that were forbidden by law, or condemned by religious and moral authorities, yet persisted because they fulfilled human desires that couldn't be completely suppressed. Let's examine these forbidden activities more closely, because they reveal as much about the societies that condemned them as about the activities themselves. Prostitution, which we've touched on already, deserves deeper examination. In every culture and time period we've discussed, prostitution was both ubiquitous and officially condemned. The Christian Church called it a sin, Islamic law forbade it. Yet it thrived in and around taverns from London to Istanbul to Port Royal. The reasons were complex. Economically, prostitution offered women a way to survive in societies that provided few legitimate opportunities for female independence. A widow with children to feed, a peasant girl fleeing an abusive home, a slave who had been freed but had no resources, all might turn to prostitution as the best or only option available. But the demand side was equally important. Societies that restricted sexual expression in other contexts, that condemned premarital sex, adultery, and other forms of non-procreative sexuality, created enormous demand for commercial sex. Men who couldn't or wouldn't marry, soldiers far from home, travelers in strange cities, even married men seeking variety or practices their wives wouldn't accept, all contributed to demand that prostitutes met. Taverns were ideal locations for prostitution, because they provided the necessary infrastructure, private rooms where transactions could occur, a steady stream of potential customers, a tavern keeper who could facilitate introductions, provide security, and take a cut of the profits. In some cases, the tavern keeper essentially ran a brothel disguised as a tavern. The experiences of prostitutes varied enormously. In the better establishments, women might have some degree of autonomy, the ability to refuse customers, protection from violence, and the possibility of eventually saving enough money to retire from the trade. In the worst places, women were essentially slaves, brutalized by customers and pimps alike, with no hope of escape. The violence against prostitutes was endemic and rarely punished. A prostitute who was beaten or even killed by a customer had little recourse. The legal system offered minimal protection to women whose profession was itself illegal. Other customers, and the tavern keeper, might intervene if violence was too extreme or too public, but this was based on self-interest rather than any sense of justice. Disease was another constant threat. Sexually transmitted infections were common, and often deadly in an era before effective treatments. Prostitutes who contracted these diseases faced not just physical suffering, but economic ruin, as customers avoided them and their ability to work disappeared. Yet despite all these horrors, some prostitutes managed to achieve a measure of success, and even respectability. The most skilled could attract wealthy patrons who provided financial security. Some accumulated enough money to establish themselves as madams, managing other women. A very few managed to marry their way out of the profession, though this was rare and required extraordinary circumstances. Gambling was another universally condemned but universally practiced activity. Religious authorities across all the cultures we've examined condemned gambling as a sin and a social evil. It led to poverty, violence, family breakdown, and all manner of other problems. Yet taverns from medieval Europe to pirate Caribbean hosted gambling constantly. The forms varied. Dice games like hazard and raffle, card games like primero, wagering on cockfights, dogfights, and other blood sports, betting on almost anything with an uncertain outcome. The specific games changed, but the fundamental appeal remained constant, the possibility of winning money and the excitement of risk. The psychology of gambling is complex. For poor people, gambling offered one of the few chances to dramatically improve their circumstances. A lucky throw of the dice could win more money than a month of hard labor. This made gambling rational in a perverse way, even though the odds were against any individual gambler, and the house always won in the long run. For wealthy people, gambling offered excitement and status competition. Demonstrating that you could afford to lose large sums of money was a way of displaying wealth and power. Beating other wealthy gamblers was a way of establishing dominance. The money itself was less important than what winning or losing said about you as a person. The tavern keepers understood all this and exploited it ruthlessly. They ran games where the house had an advantage. They hired professional gamblers to fleece unwary customers. They encouraged excessive drinking to impair judgment. They extended credit to losers, creating debt that could be called in later or used as leverage for other purposes. The violence that surrounded gambling followed predictable patterns. Accusations of cheating, whether true or false, often led to fights. Losers who couldn't pay their debts might be beaten, or worse. Winners who weren't careful about protecting their winnings might be robbed. The combination of alcohol, money, and wounded pride was explosive. Religious and political subversion were perhaps the most dangerous forbidden activities that occurred in taverns. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, Both church and state tried to control what people believed and said. Heresy, blasphemy, sedition, and treason were all serious crimes that could result in execution. Yet, taverns provided spaces where official doctrines could be questioned, where forbidden ideas could be expressed, where dissent could be voiced. The temporary community formed by drinking together created a sense of safety that was often illusory, but allowed people to speak more freely than they otherwise would. In Crusader-era Europe, taverns might host discussions that questioned church teachings. A veteran of the Crusades might express doubts about whether Muslims were really going to hell, or whether the whole enterprise of killing in Christ's name made any sense. These were dangerous thoughts that could lead to charges of heresy if spoken in the wrong context. In Ottoman Istanbul, coffeehouses and bozahouses became notorious as spaces where political opposition could form. Critics of the Sultan's policies might gather to complain and plot. Religious minorities might discuss their grievances. These establishments were infiltrated by government spies, but the volume of conversation and the number of establishments made complete surveillance impossible. The caravanserais, despite their official status as state-sponsored institutions, also sometimes became sites of political discussion and planning. Merchants traveling from different provinces could share information about local conditions, rebellions, economic problems, and official corruption. This information network, flowing through caravanserais, could become the foundation for organized opposition to the government. In the Caribbean pirate havens, the subversion was less subtle. These taverns openly celebrated rejection of legitimate authority. Pirates toasted to the death of kings and governors. They mocked religion and traditional morality. They represented an alternative to the increasingly rigid hierarchies of European society. A world where a man's worth was determined by his courage and ability rather than his birth or connections. Black market commerce in forbidden goods was yet another category of tavern activity. In every society, certain goods were prohibited or heavily restricted. In Muslim lands, alcohol was theoretically forbidden. In Christian Europe during Lent, meat was banned. In all societies, various luxury goods might be taxed heavily or restricted to certain classes. Taverns served as retail outlets for these forbidden goods. A Muslim who wanted to drink wine could find it in certain taverns, willing to take the risk. A Christian who wanted meat during Lent could purchase it discreetly from the right tavern keeper. Goods that were supposed to be restricted to nobility could be acquired by wealthy commoners through tavern connections. The drug trade, such as it existed in the pre-modern era, also flowed through taverns. Opium from the East, tobacco from the Americas, various herbal preparations with psychoactive properties. All of these could be purchased in taverns. The distinction between medicine and intoxicant was blurred, and tavern keepers often doubled as informal apothecaries, selling substances that might cure or might simply get you high. Information itself was a commodity traded in taverns. Merchants would pay for intelligence about market conditions in distant cities. Criminals would pay for information about potential targets. Authorities would pay for intelligence about conspiracies and rebellions. Tavern keepers, tavern workers, and tavern customers all participated in this information economy. The sale of military information was particularly lucrative and dangerous. A soldier who revealed details about troop movements, fortifications, or strategic plans to the wrong person could cause enormous damage and face execution if caught. Yet the temptation to earn quick money by selling such information was strong, especially for soldiers who were poorly paid or not paid at all. Sexual activities beyond simple prostitution also occurred in taverns. Adultery, sodomy, and other acts considered immoral or illegal by the standards of the time found expression in the relative privacy of tavern rooms. The anonymity provided by being away from one's home community, the disinhibiting effects of alcohol, and the general atmosphere of transgression all contributed to sexual behaviors that wouldn't occur in other contexts. The exploitation of children was one of the darkest aspects of tavern culture across this entire period. Children worked in taverns, serving customers, cleaning, cooking, and often being sexually abused by customers and proprietors alike. Child prostitution existed, though it was condemned even by most of those who accepted adult prostitution as inevitable. The legal systems of the time offered minimal protection for children. In most places, children had few rights and were considered the property of their parents or masters. A child working in a tavern who was abused had little recourse. If they complained, they might simply be thrown out to starve or worse. Slavery and indentured servitude were closely connected to tavern culture in many regions. In the Caribbean pirate havens, enslaved people worked in taverns, and taverns were markets where human beings were bought and sold. In the Ottoman Empire, slaves and former slaves worked in bozahouses and coffeehouses. Even in Europe, various forms of unfree labor existed, and taverns both employed such workers and facilitated their trade. The forged documents trade was particularly active in tavern culture. False travel papers, fake letters of credit, forged contracts, counterfeit official seals, all could be purchased through tavern connections. This enabled criminals to travel more easily, to commit frauds, to escape prosecution, and to operate across jurisdictions where they would otherwise be recognized and arrested. The underground financial system that operated through taverns was remarkably sophisticated. Money could be transferred between cities without physical movement of coins through a system of credits and debts that resembled modern banking. Loans could be arranged outside official channels, often at usurious rates. Money could be laundered, its criminal origins obscured through a series of transactions that made it appear legitimate. All of these forbidden activities shared certain characteristics. They fulfilled human needs and desires that official society either couldn't or wouldn't satisfy. They operated in spaces that were semi-public, not completely hidden but not completely visible either. They depended on networks of trust and mutual interest that transcended official legal and social structures. And they persisted despite repeated attempts to suppress them, because the underlying conditions that made them profitable and attractive remained fundamentally unchanged. Violence, retribution, and justice. The violence that pervaded tavern culture across all the societies we've examined wasn't simply random or irrational. It followed patterns, served functions, and was embedded in larger systems of honor, masculinity, and social order. To understand medieval and early modern taverns, we need to understand the violence that was inseparable from them. In every culture we've discussed, honor was a form of capital, a resource that could be accumulated, spent, and lost. A man's reputation for courage, strength, and willingness to use violence when necessary determined his standing in his community. An insult to one's honor had to be answered, or the loss of reputation could be catastrophic. Taverns were spaces where honor was constantly being tested and contested. Men who had been drinking were more likely to perceive insults where none were intended. They were more likely to respond to real insults with violence rather than words. They were more willing to fight, and less capable of fighting effectively, which often led to more serious injuries and deaths. The triggers for violence were remarkably consistent across cultures. A disputed gambling debt, a woman's attention competed over, a perceived slight in how someone was spoken to or looked at, political or religious arguments, ethnic or class tensions, competition over resources, or simply the boredom and aggression of men trained in violence with nothing else to do. The actual fighting varied based on weapons availability and cultural fighting styles. In European taverns, knife fighting predominated. The confined spaces and presence of civilians made swords impractical, except in extreme circumstances. Fighting was brutal and practical, focused on disabling or killing the opponent as quickly as possible. In Ottoman coffeehouses and bozahouses, fighting styles were influenced by various ethnic groups' traditions. Turkish, Arab, Kurdish, Greek, and Armenian fighting techniques all mingled. Weapons ranged from knives to clubs to improvised instruments. In Caribbean pirate taverns, the violence reached its most extreme expression. These were men who made their living through violence, who had killed numerous times, who viewed death as commonplace. When pirates fought each other, the results were often fatal, and the authorities, such as they were, had little interest in investigating or prosecuting tavern deaths among people who were already outlaws. The response to tavern violence depended heavily on who was involved. If a nobleman killed a peasant in a tavern, the nobleman might face no consequences at all. If a peasant killed another peasant, local justice might be swift and harsh, or the death might be ignored entirely depending on circumstances. If a peasant killed a nobleman, the peasant would certainly be executed, probably after torture, and possibly his family would face punishment as well. Gender played a crucial role in how violence was perceived and punished. Men were expected to be capable of violence and to use it when necessary to defend their honor. Women were expected to be victims of violence, not perpetrators, Though this didn't always hold true, women who did commit violence in taverns, whether in self-defense or otherwise, often faced harsher judgments than men because they had violated gender norms. The aftermath of violence created new cycles of conflict. Blood feuds between families could last for generations, originating in a tavern brawl that escalated into murder. These feuds created alliances and enmities that structured entire communities, determining who could trade with whom, who could marry whom, and who would support whom in future conflicts. Law enforcement, such as it existed, had limited ability to prevent or punish tavern violence. Constables and watchmen were often part-time workers, poorly paid and poorly trained. They might be hesitant to intervene in tavern fights involving dangerous criminals. They might be corrupt, accepting bribes to look the other way, or they might simply be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of violence. When authorities did respond to tavern violence, the goal was often more about making an example than achieving justice. Public executions, floggings and mutilations sent messages about the consequences of disrupting social order. But these spectacles were also entertainment, drawing crowds who enjoyed watching others suffer. The line between justice and sadism was thin to non-existent. Some taverns developed reputations for being particularly dangerous. These became attractions in themselves for men seeking to prove their courage or establish their reputations. A fighter who survived a night at the most dangerous tavern in the city gained status. One who dominated such a space, who could walk in and command respect through his reputation alone, was someone to be reckoned with. The tavern keepers themselves often had to be capable of violence to maintain order. A weak tavern keeper who couldn't handle troublemakers would see his establishment descend into chaos. The best tavern keepers were men who combined physical intimidation with diplomatic skills, knowing when to crack heads and when to pour another round and calm things down. Some taverns employed professional enforcers, men whose job was to keep order through threat or application of violence. These men might be ex-soldiers, criminals themselves, or simply large and tough individuals who were willing to hurt people for money. They were the proto-bouncers, establishing a role that continues in bars to this day. The weapons culture in taverns reflected and reinforced the violence. Knives were universal, carried by virtually everyone for practical purposes, but also as weapons. Swords were status symbols, and deadly weapons for those who could afford them. Clubs, both improvised and purpose-built, offered reach and impact, and every object in a tavern could become a weapon: bottles, chairs, plates, tankards, eating utensils, even food if thrown hard enough. The medical response to tavern violence was primitive and often made things worse. Wounds were cleaned with whatever was available, often alcohol, which was at least somewhat effective as an antiseptic. Bleeding was sometimes controlled by cauterization, pressing hot metal against wounds, which was agonizing and left terrible scars. Broken bones were set without anesthesia, often poorly. Many people who survived the initial violence died from infections, blood loss, or complications from injuries. But some people survived, and even thrived in this violent environment. Professional fighters, gladiators of the tavern scene, made their livings through gambling on their own fighting ability. They would challenge others to fights for money, often with the tavern keeper taking a cut of the bets. These men were dangerous, skilled, and often psychopathic, enjoying violence for its own sake. The intersection of violence and alcohol created patterns that recurred across all cultures. The disinhibition caused by drinking made people more aggressive. The impairment of judgment and motor skills made fights more chaotic and often more deadly, as people couldn't properly defend themselves or judge when to stop. The memory problems caused by heavy drinking meant that grudges were formed based on unclear recollections, leading to conflicts that escalated based on misunderstandings. Suicide, while not strictly violence against others, was another dark aspect of tavern culture. People who had lost everything gambling, who had been cast out by their families, who faced execution for crimes, who simply couldn't cope with the harshness of medieval life, sometimes chose taverns as the places to end their lives. The availability of alcohol, the presence of weapons, the relative privacy of some tavern rooms, all made this easier. The religious responses to tavern violence varied, but were generally ineffective. Churches condemned violence in principle, but often made exceptions for violence in defense of honor or faith. The church's position on dueling, for instance, evolved over the centuries, sometimes condemning it absolutely and sometimes accepting it as a legitimate way to resolve disputes. This ambiguity gave men who wanted to fight permission to do so, while still maintaining they were good Christians. Islamic authorities had similar struggles. Violence was condemned, but jihad was celebrated. Honor killings were theoretically forbidden, but often tolerated. The Sultan wanted order, but also needed warriors. These contradictions created spaces where violence could be rationalized and justified. The long-term trends across the 1,000 years we've examined show a gradual reduction in casual violence, but not its elimination. As states became stronger and law enforcement more professional, tavern violence came under greater control. But it never disappeared entirely, and in some ways simply became more hidden, moving from public spaces to private ones, from overt to covert. The legacy of tavern violence lives on in modern bar culture. Bars are still places where fights break out, where honor is contested, where alcohol-fueled aggression erupts into physical conflict. The weapons and specific triggers may have changed, but the basic dynamics remain recognizable to anyone familiar with the taverns of the past 1,000 years. Conclusion: 1,000 years of shadows. As our journey through a millennium of tavern history comes to a close, what have we learned? What does this 1,000-year exploration of the dark underbelly of hospitality establishments tell us about human nature, about the societies that tried to control these spaces, and about the eternal tension between order and chaos? First, we've seen that despite enormous differences in culture, religion, geography, and time period, taverns served remarkably similar functions across all the societies we've examined. Whether we're talking about a Crusader-era inn in England, a Seljuk caravanserai in Anatolia, a Plague-era alehouse, an Ottoman bozahouses in Istanbul, or a pirate tavern in Port Royal, these establishments were all spaces where the official narrative of their societies collided with messy reality. They were places where social hierarchies were temporarily suspended, or at least relaxed. A nobleman and a peasant might not be equals anywhere else. But in a tavern, they could drink together, gamble together, even fight together. This didn't mean true equality, of course. The nobleman would still expect deference and would face fewer consequences if violence erupted. But the possibility of interaction across class lines existed in taverns in a way it rarely did elsewhere. There were spaces where forbidden desires could be satisfied. Sexual appetites, gambling urges, the desire for intoxication, the need to speak freely about politics and religion, all found outlets in taverns that were unavailable or far more dangerous in other contexts. The tavern was a pressure valve for the repressions and restrictions of medieval and early modern society. They were economic institutions that operated according to logic different from other businesses. Profit was certainly important, but so was reputation, influence, and the complex web of obligations and relationships that determined success or failure. A tavern keeper who maximized short-term profits by cheating customers and running a disreputable establishment would soon have no customers at all. A tavern keeper who balanced profit with hospitality, who could keep secrets and facilitate transactions, who could maintain order without being tyrannical, could become wealthy and influential. They were sites of genuine community formation. People bonded over shared drinks, shared meals, shared experiences in these spaces. Friendships were formed, partnerships were established, marriages were arranged. For all the crime and violence and exploitation, taverns also fostered human connection in ways that were vital to social functioning. But they were also spaces of tremendous suffering and cruelty. The prostitutes who were used and discarded, the gamblers who lost everything, the victims of violence who died on filthy floors far from home, the slaves and the poor and the desperate who had no other options. The tavern culture we've explored had countless victims, and most of them have been forgotten by history. We've also seen how authorities across all these societies struggled to control taverns and ultimately failed. They could regulate them, tax them, occasionally crack down on them, but they could never eliminate them or completely dictate what happened within them. The reason is simple: taverns met human needs that official society couldn't or wouldn't satisfy. People needed spaces to drink, to socialize, to find companionship, to escape the grinding hardship of medieval life, to take risks, to feel alive. Trying to suppress this through law or religious edict was like trying to hold back the tide. You could impose temporary restrictions, but the underlying forces remained, and eventually the taverns would return. The specific forms that taverns took evolved based on local conditions. The Seljuk caravanserais, with their state funding and charitable missions, were very different from Caribbean pirate taverns that existed outside any legitimate authority. But both served the fundamental function of providing spaces where normal rules didn't fully apply. where opportunities existed for both legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise. The crimes and conspiracies that unfolded in taverns, across this 1,000-year period, reveal something important about human nature. We are social animals who need to gather. We are also animals capable of tremendous cruelty and selfishness. The tavern brought these aspects together, creating spaces where the best and worst of humanity coexisted and collided. Looking at the evolution from Crusader-era inns to 18th century pirate taverns, we can see a general trend toward more commercialization, more specialization, and paradoxically, both more and less violence. More violence in the sense that some taverns became genuinely dangerous places where murder was common. Less violence in the sense that state authority gradually became more effective at imposing order, making casual violence in taverns somewhat riskier. But the most striking feature across this entire period is continuity rather than change. The basic dynamics of tavern culture that we see in 11th century England are still recognizable in 18th century Caribbean. The crimes, the violence, the forbidden pleasures, the social functions all persist across time and space because they're rooted in fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization. The legacy of these establishments extends far beyond their historical importance. The modern pub, bar, tavern, whatever we call it, is a direct descendant of the institutions we've explored. When you walk into a bar today, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years. The drinks may be different, the violence is usually less extreme, and modern law enforcement is far more effective, but the basic social function remains the same. These are still spaces where people gather to drink, to socialize, to escape the pressures of daily life, to take risks, to make connections. They're still places where crime sometimes happens, where forbidden activities occur, where the normal rules of society are bent, if not broken. They're still pressure valves for the restrictions and repressions of modern life, just as they were in medieval times. Understanding tavern history helps us understand the societies that tried to control these spaces, and the people who gathered in them. It shows us that the struggle between order and freedom, between respectability and authenticity, between official values and human desires, is eternal. No society has ever completely resolved these tensions, and probably no society ever will. It also reminds us that history isn't just about kings and battles and great events. It's also about ordinary people living ordinary lives, making the best choices they could in difficult circumstances. The merchants, the prostitutes, the thieves, the tavern keepers, the soldiers, the pilgrims, all of them were making history in their own small ways, shaping the world through their daily choices and actions. The taverns, inns, caravanserais, and pirate havens we've explored were spaces where real history happened, where ordinary people's lives intersected with larger historical forces, where the underground currents of crime, desire, and resistance flowed through the official structures of medieval and early modern society. So the next time you're in a bar, take a moment to appreciate the long history you're part of. That bar is a direct descendant of institutions that sheltered crusaders, that hosted merchants traveling the Silk Road, that survived the Black Death, that served fermented grain to Ottoman janissaries, and that hosted pirates spending their blood-soaked fortunes. You're participating in a tradition that has spanned millennia, that has survived empires and plagues and wars, and that continues because it serves functions no other institution quite can. Before we part ways, remember to like this video if you enjoyed this journey through the shadows of history, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of the past. Drop a comment letting me know what aspect of tavern history you found most fascinating, or what other topics you'd like to see explored in future videos. The tavern door swings shut. One final time on our journey, the fire burns down to embers. The last customer stumbles out into the dawn, but the stories continue, passed down through generations, reminding us that in every age, in every society, there are places where the human drama plays out in all its raw intensity. The medieval tavern may be gone, but its spirit lives on wherever people gather to share food, drink, stories, and the fundamental human experience of being alive in a world that is both beautiful and terrible, full of both hope and despair. Thank you for joining me on this 1,000-year journey into the shadows.